This What's Working with Cam Marston podcast is brought to you courtesy of First Horizon Bank.
Hi, I'm Tabitha Scott, a human dynamics expert and the host of Bucket Listening, brought to you by First Horizon Bank. I hope you will join me as I sit down with people from all walks of life to learn how their passions, insights, and persistence have helped them turn their bucket list into a beautiful life.
Tune in on your preferred platform or visit firsthorizon.com/podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. So grateful that you're along for the ride here on this radio show/podcast. The goal of this show, if you're new to the show, is to find the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace trends shaping business today. To find the guests that can talk about those trends in such a way that we can utilize what they tell us to make our own worlds a little bit better, our own lives a little bit easier, the lives of our families and friends a little bit easier, whatever it is. Again, welcome to What's Working. I'm glad you're along for the ride. Here's what I can promise on today's show, something very different than what we've talked about before. I have been always kind of interested in accents. I think all of us are somewhat interested in accents. We try to imitate them. We listen for them. We comment on them. And when I travel, it's every day that I travel, whether it's the cab driver, whether it's the person I'm meeting with, whoever it is. And they say, "So Cam, where are you from?" And I say, "My hometown is in Mobile, Alabama." And I usually get this question: have you always lived in Mobile? What they're trying to get me to tell them is that I'm a recent transplant to Mobile, that I'm not from there. And my reaction to that every time is, no, I've always lived there. I lived away for a little while, but born and raised in Mobile, Alabama. And the comment always is, you sure don't sound like you're from Mobile. In other words, I don't have a Southern accent that they would expect from Mobile, Alabama. And I've wondered, did I ever have one? Did I lose it? Did I intentionally lose it? Did I hang out with people that didn't have them, that didn't have a Southern accent, and their lack of an accent imprinted on me in some way or another, and I've never gained one back? I don't know. And I've always wondered about these things. I don't know. I've got stories about accents nevertheless. Okay. Flash forward to last week, maybe the week before. I'm reading the Economist magazine on an airplane. It's the October 14th edition of the Economist. There's an author with a column. The column is simply called Johnson. And the column is titled Drawl Down, D-R-A-W-L down, Drawl Down. And it's about accents. And it's about how the Southern accent is going away, largely because of the mass movement of people into the South from non-Southern states. The article focuses on the areas around Atlanta more than others. But it goes to say that this is going on nearly throughout the South. As more people move from out of the South into the South, the accent is beginning to go away. Turns out one of the people quoted in the article is a man named Paul Reed. He's a linguist, as it says, at the University of Alabama. And I'm interested in this subject. I'm interested in this article. I reach out, I find Paul Reed on the internet, and I ask him, hey, can I put you on the radio show to talk about accents and what they mean for business, what they mean for sales, what they mean for first impressions as I'm trying to create an impression in my clients, in my accounts, in my employees, in my team. And he responded, one of the magics of running this radio show, he responded with, yes, I'd love to. So when we get back from break, we're going to talk to Paul Reed out of his office at the University of Alabama, where he's in a sound studio, a sound booth, he told me, to do his research on linguistics and accents, to talk about the changing accents and what it means for you and me. If I'm going into an environment full of Southern accents, deep Southern accents, should I try to resurrect a Southern accent from my background, or will it harm me? If I step out in front of a group of people who don't know me well, should I consciously try to lose any vestiges of a Southern accent that I have? If this is controllable, how should you and I control it? And for those of you not from the South, what should you think about people when you hear a Southern accent? It's usually associated with idiocy, frankly, particularly in men. Anyway, fun conversation coming up on the other side of the break with Paul Reed out of the University of Alabama. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. We'll be right back after this break with something I know you haven't heard on this show before. Be right back.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence, but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit, with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Thank you so much for joining us. This is, as I promised in the opening segment, going to be an interesting conversation. On the other side of a Zoom call from me is Paul Reed in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He's in his sound closet, his whisper room, rather, is what it's called. I wish you could see this. Let me give you a little bit of Paul's background, then I'll ask him to get further into it on his own. He's a phonetician and a phonologist with a primary interest in sociophonetic variation, dialects, and language change. He goes further from this, the bio does. I'll pick and choose from it as we go along. Paul, thank you so much for your time and welcome to What's Working.
Well, thank you very much. It's a joy to be here, and I'm happy to be here and happy to help in any way that I can.
So my listener, as I told you prior to us starting the recording, is a 45-ish year old. 75% of the audience is male. And we're going to talk about how this matters to them, dialects and accents, and most importantly, how it matters in the work world and things like that. That's what they're listening for. My listeners are looking for insights into that. Before we get into that, tell me a little bit about yourself and where this interest in dialects came from.
Sure. So I am originally from Northeast Tennessee, so Hancock County, and it's right where Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia all come together. So I am a educated hillbilly. So I just was good at school and kept going until they gave me all the degrees that I could get. But I learned early on from hearing my parents talk. I could tell when they picked up the phone after they said hello, that next sentence, however they said it, whether they were talking to somebody local or somebody from off. And so we sort of just growing up, I kind of got interested in sound and just always was fascinated by it. And then I realized in college that I could study language and study language scientifically. So I'm kind of a numbers guy, kind of a professional nerd, but I'll get to sort of study language, measure vowels and consonants and different things like that, and then sort of apply that sort of with the sociological or anthropological view to sort of see who talks different and kind of start to theorize and hypothesize why people sound different.
And why do they sound different? Let's jump off there.
So I like to tell my students language varies by time, space, and society. So time, we sort of sound a little different than our parents, sound different from our grandparents. We sound really different from our great-great-grandparents. So just as we learn language, we learn it a little differently than our parents and grandparents and so on. And so language changes a little bit over generations. And if you think about how long, humans have been speaking language, well, it's changed a lot. Well, by region, if you think about it, really easy trends, at transportation has only been a 20th and 21st century thing. For, centuries, a mountain was a hard thing to cross. A river was a hard thing to cross. So as people got separated by geography and sort of space, things change, small differences in communities, small differences that were very small at one point in time, get further and further and further apart as time goes. And then society, it's sort of like that sort of gets everything else. Like we know that men sound a little different than women. We know that white folks sound a little different than black folks. We know that, people that have one particular interest or one particular career may sound a little different than somebody else who has a different interest or sort of personal identity kind of thing. And so that's where we start seeing the three ways that language varies by space, time, and society. All that together is kind of what I study.
And it creates accents. And as you know, you came to my attention reading through the October 14th edition of The Economist in an article called Drawl Down, where you're quoted. And it says in this article that when people from outside the United States imitate Americans, they're more likely than not to choose a Southern accent. Define for me a Southern accent. What is it I know it when I hear it, but define it for me.
So it's the way that people sound in what is the southeastern portion of the United States. So if you think about it, one of the traditional boundaries of the South is the Ohio River to the north, and then depending on which Texan you talk to, somewhere out there, like so Texas or sort of halfway through Texas, and then all the way down to Florida, then again there's sort of some debate about how far down in Florida it covers, but so you're looking at millions of people. And
right.
So there's a lot of ways that people sound within the South, but there are some stereotypes that have emerged. So things like saying, my and time, right? Where some other folks might say my and time. And so because of the South existing as sort of a thing in people's minds, so the South is an entity that people think about, and that way of speaking is associated with the South. So that gets spread and it kind of gets into the culture and gets into sort of circulating. Some of them are negative stereotypes, some of them are positive stereotypes, but it kind of gets into the culture. And then when people start thinking about the U.S., well, what sort of exists in the U.S. mind? Well, the South does. And then, so that's one of the things. And then there are a couple others that people tend to imitate. So like New York, you get folks that do know about Texas just as an entity, maybe California, but the South, because it's a big region, and there's also that way of talking associated with the South. That's what happens.
How much of an accent is willfully chosen? In other words, I want people to recognize my roots, so I'm going to willfully say my in time, versus how much of it is nurtured from birth, what you hear as a child, from your parents, over the television, etc.
So it's a little bit of both. So there's you tend to sound like the people that raised you. So if you are raised by people that sound Southern, you will most likely at least start out when you first start talking sounding Southern. And then as you sort of grow and become more independent, and sometimes it's like subconscious things of like, hey, I kept going to school. And so there are certain things that just sort of because of the input that you receive, they kind of fade away. Other folks that maybe didn't have the same opportunity to go to school, they get a little different input over the course of their lives. But then we also know that saying and sounding certain ways have meanings outside of just ourselves, right? So sounding Southern has some meaning. Some of them can be positive, some of them could be negative. And so if we want to associate ourselves with those positive aspects like home and belonging and solidarity, then we may sound more Southern. But at the same time, we also know that there are some negative stereotypes. And so we may want to disassociate ourselves from those. And so we may stop using some of those language features that sort of point out those negative things. And so there's always that balance within each sort of person of we tend to sound like the people we were raised around. And then as we get more independence, we sort of have some choices. Now, sometimes people do make overt choices like, hey, I'm not going to say X because of, repercussions or changing societal norms, or sometimes like, hey, I just don't want to sound that way because I don't want to be associated with whatever sounding that way might mean. And then there's again, something that's some parts are really hard to change. So you can hear me speaking, right? So one of the things that's sort of pretty common throughout the South is what we call the pin-pin merger. So that's PIN. PEN. Now you can tell I don't make a difference in those pin. Like, so the thing that's like pokey and the things that you write with, I say the same. So growing up, we would say ink pen and stick pin. So that way it sort of disambiguates any sort of, possible confusion. But even though I know that there's, some folks say those differently, it's really hard for me to do that. But at the same time, I also know that some folks, if they hear me say like nice white rice, they may want to make some judgments about my abilities or something like that. So some things are controllable, like consciously, but some things are not as controllable. And that kind of depends on the thing, that like the particular feature, but also some things are just less noticeable. We call it in linguistics salient. So it's basically just, it doesn't jump out at either the speaker or the listener very much.
Real quick before we go to break, does accent include word choice?
Yes.
Touch that real quick, and I can't give you too much time. We'll pick
Sure.
it up after break, but you use the word disambiguate, which is not, so does accent touch word choice real quick?
Sure. So yeah, because it includes sort of like the words that you use. So like if we're thinking about your like a Southern accent, depending on where you're from in the South, there may be words that you use or that are common where you're from that are sort of indicative of being from there. Think about folks that live near the coast and the words they have for different types of, ocean things or boats, or people that live near farms. And so some of that is sort of naturally there, but then there's also some things about like cultural things. So like what barbecue itself means. Is it the food, or is it the event, or is it the way of cooking?
And there's a correct answer to that. I want to pick that up when we come back from break. Before we go to break, I want to remind listeners about First Horizon Bank's Bucket Listening podcast. It's interviews with CEOs who have chosen to pursue their bucket list well before retirement. Why wait till retirement to pursue your bucket list? Start it right now. First Horizon Bank sponsors it. You can find it on any one of the major podcast platforms. Look for Bucket Listening. We'll be back right after this break.
This is Bill Eastet. I perfected my baking recipe behind my live music stage at my little restaurant in Fairhope, Alabama. We have custom-made smokers and small batch bacon made just for you. So if you're looking for the best bacon in America that has been cured, smoked, and even serenaded by songwriters, you definitely need to try Billy's Small Batch Bacon. www.billysbacon.com.
Paul Reed is on the other side of a Zoom call from me. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. He's a phonetician and phonologist at the University of Alabama. I read about him in the Economist magazine, and I immediately started marking the column up, thinking, I wonder what relation this may have, an accent may have, to the world of workplace, workforce, and marketplace trends. And I think there's a lot to do with first impressions. And Paul, I want to go back to something you said in the last segment to begin this conversation. Your mother would pick up the phone, she'd say hello. And what she said after that, so assuming she said hello, the person on the other side said something, and you could hear her accent change and make a determination of who might be on the other end of that call. Meaning to me, and I ask you to weigh in on this, she was trying to form an impression in the person on that other side of the phone based on what she did to her accent. Is that correct?
That is. So there are, the way that we speak reflects who we are. And, depending on where you're from, what you do, how much education you have, the color of your skin, the things that you do, there are going to be certain judgments, both positive and negative, that people sort of constantly make. And just one of the ways, again, if you think about, phone calls, podcasts, radio shows, the only thing you have is your voice. And so people are going to hear certain features and aspects of it, and then make judgments. So growing up where I did in Northeast Tennessee, in the mountains, which, by the way, this time of year would be beautiful.
Oh, man.
But there's also the fact that some people see it as backwoods. Some people see it as, country or redneck. And there's the chance that sounding like you're from there might open up the possibility of stigma. But it's also the possibility of knowing that that's also home and positive. And so think about the idea of like the home place, going to be around family and friends. And so you have these competing notions of what sounding a certain way may mean for folks. So there's the people that you might want to sort of change your speaking a little bit to reflect, hey, I want to highlight this aspect of myself. Like, oh, okay. Like right now, I'm being interviewed as a professor from the university. So I'm minding my linguistic P's and Q's, so to speak. But if you and I were, sitting in a sports bar, having a beverage, watching a football game, we might not be speaking the exact same way that we are right now because we're in a different situation, and the different parts of us that we would be sort of letting down our linguistic hair, so to speak, in certain situations. And sometimes that's what you do to sort of highlight the different parts of who you are.
A part of belonging, a part of either belonging or, in some cases, not belonging. And I'll relate a story real quick, and that is I gave a speech many years ago, and a lady came up to me after the speech and said, I couldn't understand a thing that you said, but I sure liked the way it sounded. And I thought, I've just wasted an hour of her and my time. And I think at that point, I tried to begin, I don't know if this is the correct terminology, but to round out my vowels, to sound less Southern so that the people that I was giving speeches to wouldn't listen for the accent, but instead for the content. And now when I travel, it's at least once a day when I travel, people say, you sure don't sound like you're from Mobile, Alabama. Comment on that for me. Is that, should I be embarrassed by that? What do you think?
It's one of those things of where, obviously, like in a perfect world, where we wouldn't judge people by the way they talk, because it's just, That's part of who they are. Like I said earlier, you kind of sound like the people you grew up around, the voices that you heard from family and friends and the people during that time frame. You tend to sound like them. But also, we don't live in a perfect world. So people will make, judgments about, certain stereotypes about people. Now, you and I both know there are plenty of Southerners who are some of the smartest human beings on this entire planet. We also know that there are other Southerners who aren't. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one person is right or wrong. It just means that there are differences. But sometimes things get associated with, and those circulating stereotypes. And so sounding a certain way can sort of trigger those stereotypes in people's minds. So in what you were referring to, you don't always hear the Southern accent in speeches or on popular media from the quote unquote smart person, right?
Yeah. When they want a dumb person on television, they'll put a Southern accent on them. And it infuriates me. And it's more often than not a male.
Absolutely.
Let's make Dad a dumb Southern guy.
Yep. And so there's some really cool research sort of about that. And so there's this idea that sounding Southern is associated with certain, in this case, oftentimes negative tropes. It tends to be, again, a lack of education, a lack of sophistication. And it is, strangely enough, more readily associated with males, so that if you hear a Southern voice, you think male first. Like if I just said, who sounds Southern, you're probably going to, first thing is like a guy, and then there's going to be some other sort of stereotypes that people go to. So it's one of those things that sounding a certain way triggers that in the listener. And so sometimes you don't want to necessarily do that. And we tend to change the things that jump out at listeners the most. And so those are those features like the I, some of the, maybe some of the word choice. You might not say reckon, right? If where I grew up, a lot of folks would say, I reckon, like I reckon it's over there. And other folks would be, almost like horrified if such a word would ever, come out of their mouth.
Well, I affiliate reckon somewhat with the word fixin'. Yep. It's one that I can't bring myself to say other than I'm fixing a drink, I'm fixing breakfast. Fixin' to is not something that I would feel comfortable saying, yet it's very common.
Yeah, because it also, language is useful, right? We use language to sort of do things. And so fixin' to or fixin' to, right, is what we would call, it's a future tense marker. And so what's really happening, and also with fixin' to, it's a relatively immediate future, right? So we can all say, I'm going to go, right? But if I say I'm fixing to go, I'm probably putting my shoes on and getting my coat and I'm ready to head out the door. You wouldn't say, I'm fixing to go next year. Because that sounds weird, right? Now you can say, I'm going to go next year. So those, we both have those sort of future markers that we use, but there's all this sort of useful and utility in having fixing to as a sort of like an immediate future. Another one that's one of my favorites are these, we call them double modal. So like this is phrases like might, could, might, would, used to, could. Those are highly associated with the South, and sometimes sort of like the inland mountain South, so Appalachia primarily. But those folks that use double modals and say things like I might could do that or you might should do that, they also say I might do that and you should do that. But there's a little bit of nuance there. And so you can say like there's a slight difference between I might do it, I could do it, and I might could do it.
Yeah.
And so there's an additional sort of layer of nuance that's available to speakers of certain varieties that have these things, and speakers that don't have them. So they can be very, very useful, and they can also trigger those things about belonging and home and connection with people. So thinking about your listeners, sometimes using Southern features is a way of creating a connection with someone. So you are trying to make a connection with a client, make a connection with a sponsor, making a connection with a colleague. You can use those features as a way to say, this is part of who I am, and maybe make a connection with that same part of that colleague or sponsor or client.
I want to get into the implications to business and leadership and things of that nature. I want to get into the fear of faking an accent. Let's assume I'm a part of this article in The Economist talks about the extraordinary movement towards the South and what it's doing to a lot of the Southern accents. It's wiping them out as people are more homogenized, more than they've been before. But I think of let's say a manager or a leader stepping into a new role with people he or she has not met before who have all Southern accent and trying to fake something like this. And that's where the spoofs on the television come from. That's a 30-minute comedy. And it's an absolute determinant of failure for this individual to try to fake these types of things, which means, I'm kind of talking to myself here, we can pick and choose to turn this stuff on and off. And perhaps when we come back from break, the conversation should be, when should we pick and choose when to turn these things off when we think about our customers, our clients, and things like that? So let's put this in the hands or the minds of the listeners who are thinking business and workplace after this break. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Glad to have you along. Paul Reed is on the other side of a Zoom call from me from the University of Alabama. Be right back after this break.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence, but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit, with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Paul Reed is on the other side of a Zoom call from what he calls his Whisper Room, which I think may be a brand. Is it a brand?
It is.
The Whisper Room in his office at University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Paul, let's put this into the hands and the minds of the listeners who are business focused. This show is about workplace, workforce, and marketplace trends. Let's talk about stereotypes. Let's talk about I lead people or I'm calling on people. What about accents? And this is a wide open question. What about accents do they need to keep in mind?
One thing is, so every time you open your mouth, you're signaling a little bit about who you are. Right? So you when you speak in front of a group, they're going to be hearing your voice and then making certain, sometimes snap judgments. Sometimes, maybe it may be triggering a memory. It may be triggering all sorts of different things. Some of that's unavoidable. And we also know, and sometimes overtly or consciously, and sometimes more sort of subconsciously, we know how sounding a certain way may sort of jump out to different people. So when we think about, and it's oftentimes, again, like you mentioned earlier, when people are trying to fake an accent. So say you're trying to artificially create that connection because you're in a room full of Southern folks, and you are not Southern, and you are going to try to throw in a y'all or mine. And it jumps out to me if we think about, Brian Kelly, when he went to LSU last year or year before, I can't remember, and he was speaking to the LSU crowd, and he got roundly ridiculed for attempting to fake a Southern accent in this particular situation, because it read as very inauthentic, because people know how it's supposed to sound, especially if you're talking to members of that group of whatever it may be. Politicians are notorious for this, right? We hear all the time in every campaign season. Of course, we kind of live in a perpetual campaign season now, where depending on the group they're talking to, they sort of shift and change. And at some level, we all do that. We all sort of adjust based on where we are. So again, like the formality of the situation, people we don't really know versus people we know really well. I'm a professor, so I'll lecture multiple times a week to, a room full of 19 and 20-year-olds. That's a little different than the way when I'm hanging out with my friends watching a basketball game, or when I'm playing basketball in the men's leagues that I'm in. Though we all change a little bit based on the situation, but we change authentically based on who we are. It's sort of when you try to inauthentically do that, that really registers as fake and can be very sort of offensive to folks, in the sense of you immediately become less trustworthy because it's not what you sound like. It's not how you normally sound. So, people can shift and morph and choose to do certain things to sort of build that camaraderie, right? So there's always that give and take. Language is constantly changing. So there are new things coming in, but it's when it's something that is very associated with a particular group. So things like y'all, things like, like we talked about, or might, could, or fixing to, or some of those that are very salient and sort of jump out as being very Southern things. Those are some things that are available for Southerners to use to sort of create those connections. But if someone who is not Southern tries to use them in a way that doesn't feel natural, then it's harder to create those same connections. Now, I will say, speaking about the word y'all has won the sort of that second person plural, because there's also, there's all the possibilities. There's the you, sort of the bear, you guys, y'all, you all, use. There's all of those that are kind of spread throughout the country. But y'all won that battle. Like it's spreading. There's lots of people who sort of natively and authentically use y'all. I was in Southern California, and the server came up and just very naturally, in a very Southern California way, said, "Can I get y'all anything?" And I was just kind of gobsmacked. I was like, wait a minute, is y'all here too? And it was. So I was like, as a proud son of the South, I was like, yes, y'all is winning.
Yeah, y'all dudes. Can I get y'all dudes anything? Right. So we talk about stereotypes, and we talked about it from the point of view of me, perhaps, perpetuating a stereotype. A lot of listeners aren't in the South, and they, they'll hear perhaps an accent and want to quickly stereotype. Can you discuss stereotypes, not from the one that's delivering the information on themselves, but from the receiver, and cautioning them about a stereotype?
Yeah, and you always want to be careful because, again, stereotypes are ways that we try to level out any variability. We try to sort of group everything together to sort of make it easier for us to make judgments. And when we think about accents, we want to be very careful about making those judgments about people for like an entire group. So if we take the Southern accent, as we've been talking about, there are plenty of brilliant people in the South. We have, some of the finest universities in the world. We have, organizations, Fortune 500 companies full of folks that grew up in the South and sound a certain way. So they are by no means dumb. But sometimes that gets associated, sounding Southern gets associated with being dumb because of historical things, because of sort of accidents of history. People sound a certain way and they want to make the judgment about the intelligence of that person. But I'd like to do something in front of my classes. So again, I'm from a town of 1,000 people, from a county of 6,000 people. So literally right now, within probably a quarter mile of where I am currently sitting, are more people than I grew up around in my entire county. Yeah. So I sounded like that for a long time. But I also have a PhD. So if I did sort of take my filter off and started sounding a little bit more like the way I do when I'm not really thinking about it, when I'm, maybe with my wife at home or I'm with my family, I still have a PhD. So just because I sound this way doesn't mean that I'm dumb. And
so you got did I read correctly that you got your PhD from the University of Tennessee?
I got from the University of South Carolina. So
South Carolina.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was one of those, I've sort of bounced around the South. So I got my undergrad from Maryville College. It's a small school just outside of Knoxville. Got my master's from the University of Memphis. Worked in San Antonio teaching at St. Mary's University for a little bit, and then went back and got my PhD from South Carolina. So it's kind of,
you've been in accent capitals. I mean, you've been in I think the Gullah accent
Yes.
on the coast of South Carolina.
Yes.
That's a unique one there.
Yep.
I think of you've not mentioned this, but I think one of the most distinct accents is New Orleans, Southeast Louisiana, the Cajun accent, which sounds almost Brooklyn to me.
Yes.
Sounds
yes.
very New York City to me.
Yes. So there's some really good friends of mine do similar things that I do, but they focus on New Orleans. And so what she found, this is Katie Carmichael at Virginia Tech and some of her colleagues, they have looked at New Orleans and sort of found this connection to that sort of New Yorkish sound. And it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. There was a close connection between New Orleans and New York for the better part of a century, lots of trade, sort of travel back and forth. But then also, like, New Orleans was a very cosmopolitan place. There was, Spanish speakers, French speakers, English speakers from all over. Very similar in some respects to Mobile. It's just New Orleans was a little bit bigger, and so the ports were sort of like, again, it's changed hands several times. So it's got this idea of all of that people movement also impacts the language, and so that's why sometimes places like New Orleans and Mobile and Charleston and Norfolk and places that have ports tend to be a little bit different than the rest of the surrounding state because of that people movement, and that happens, and that influence carries over for a long period of time afterward. I mean, if you think about Charleston being somewhat distinct from the rest of South Carolina, or Mobile being as slightly distinct as the rest of Alabama, New Orleans being distinct from the rest of Louisiana, that's been 400 years in the making, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how that sort of plays out.
There's a lot of people in the state of Alabama that don't want to claim Mobile. It's like, we don't know what goes on. Once you get south of Greenville, things just change and we don't know how to behave. You and your Mardi Gras and your mysticism and all that kind of stuff. I call them the freaks at the end of the road.
Hey.
Each of these places you've listed are at the end of long roads. The truth is they're port cities.
Exactly.
San Francisco being another
Exactly.
one.
Exactly.
And they're just they're weird folks at the end of the road, and I like them. They're my people.
That's right.
I like the weird folks. We're coming to a close here. As you think about accents, business people, leadership, any parting shots, any parting words that you can give my listeners?
So I would always just say that, the way people sound is part of who they are. And so you really want to make sure that you're judging the person and not just the way they speak, because brilliant people are from, sound Southern. Brilliant people sound like they're from New York. Brilliant people sound like they're from New Orleans. And that's something just to remember, that the way you sound reflects who you are, and judge people by that individuality, not grouping them together.
How do they find you, Paul, if someone wants to find more about you?
Paul E. Reed, paulereed.com. You can find me on most of the socials at PERJ44. I'm pretty easy to find. If you say Paul Reed in Alabama in any search engine, it will point you my way.
Paul, thank you very much. You're listening to What's Working. We'll be right back after this break.
I'm Joey Mason. For 4 years, my goal has been to produce the best farm-to-table products I'd ever eaten. I've done just that at our on-site USDA facility in Grand Bay, Alabama, allowing us to ship directly to your door. This is true farm-to-table. Visit us at masonhillsfarm.com to see all that we have to offer.
Big thanks to Paul Reed. Quite honestly, it's a thrill for me. I don't know if you could hear it in my voice, but whenever somebody's in The Economist, I love The Economist magazine, by the way. Whenever somebody's in The Economist and I get a chance to speak to them and talk to them about their work, it's always very exciting to me. So it's he's kind of a VIP in my books, not only by what he studies, which I find fascinating. I hope you heard that in the interview, but by the attention he gets, by who he gets attention from. So really cool. I think it's interesting that we can pick and choose and determine the use of our accents on the fly. And I think what he said about his mom is really telling, I think, probably of all of us. She'd say hello on the telephone, and then the next thing she said, a moment later, she could tell who she was talking to. And the truth is probably the same for each of us. My suspicion is that when I put this microphone in front of me like I have right now and begin recording for What's Working, my accent somewhat disappears more so than otherwise it would. When I stand in front of an audience to give the seminars that I do, my accent likely disappears more so than it does. Unless, perhaps, I'm in Mobile, here in my hometown, where I can relax a little bit more. It was an interesting feeling that I got when that woman told me, as I said in the show, Cam, I don't know a word that you said, but I loved the way it sounded. I thought, gosh, it's almost insulting of the amount of work that I'd done to prepare for that presentation, and then to be told she couldn't hear it. She couldn't listen to it, but she enjoyed hearing it. I remember one time, and I'm going to go in the Wayback Machine here, and you'll have to forgive me. I was in Boston, and I was at that Copley. If you've traveled a bit, been to Boston, there's like a Copley, Fairmont Copley Place or something like that. Beautiful hotel in downtown Boston on a square. And I was being introduced to come up to the front of the room and deliver a presentation. I don't remember who, but I remember the room clearly in my head. And I remember thinking, I cannot understand a word this person is saying. And the only way I knew that it was my turn to come to the front of the room and speak was she looked at me and began clapping as an applause, and you walk out onto the stage to begin your presentation. Her accent was so Boston, was so very Boston, that I couldn't understand a word. I needed an interpreter. It sounded like a language from, from Eastern Europe or something like that. However, it was a very thick Bostonian accent. And I made fun of it when I got out to, not made fun of her, but made fun of the fact that, hey, I really struggled to understand what she said due to her Boston accent. I hope you won't struggle to understand what I say due to my Southern accent. I'm going to consciously try to round out the accent so that you don't struggle with it. Anyway, love the accent, love the conversation with Paul. If you feel like there's anybody that needs to hear this, I hear the music coming up, here's this show, go to the podcast page, what'sworkingcam.com. There you can find this show as well as all the previous ones, links to how to find them on the big podcast sites. You can also email me directly from that site. I hope you'll do so. Give me some feedback. You can find me on all the socials. Look for Cam Marston. There's one other SOB out there that also has the name Cam Marston. You'll know it's not me when you see him. And find me, follow me. You can keep up with what we got going on in the show. And it's where I promote every week's show. And I encourage you to go to the website, cammarston.com. At the bottom of that page is a place to email me. I'll send you a chapter from my book. We'll have another show next week, everybody. As you likely know, this show originates as a radio show broadcast across the state of Alabama, and it continues to grow in both radio listeners and market. After it's formatted for radio, we then turn it into this podcast. Please share it with those you think would find it interesting, and subscribe to the podcast on my YouTube page where you can leave messages and your thoughts and your comments, and I'll certainly get back in touch. Finally, if you're a fan of the show, please offer a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can find my book called What Works on Amazon.com. In it, I highlight the top 10 ideas from the first 200 episodes of the show. Mind you, they're not the top 10 best episodes, they're the top 10 best ideas. Many times the same ideas are brought up again and again by different guests, and we dig into those ideas in such a way that they'll be easily applicable for your business. Simply go to Amazon and enter my name, and you'll find What Works as well as my other books. Chapter titles include How to Find a Niche, Innovation, Building Teams, and so forth. To learn more about the workshops and seminars I offer, go to cammarston.com. There you can view clips of my work, view workshop titles, view my reviews, case studies, customer lists. It's all there. If you'd like a free copy of one of the chapters of my book, enter your email address at the bottom of the homepage at cammarston.com. And from that site, you can email me directly. I always love to hear from you. You'll also find me on social media. Find Cam Marston on all the social media platforms, and you may need to enter the numeral 1. There's one other Cam Marston out there, and that numeral 1 distinguishes me from him from time to time. So if you're unsure if it's me or not, enter that numeral 1 after my name, and it should do the trick. On a more personal and less professional side, I record weekly commentaries that air across Alabama on Alabama Public Radio twice each day on Fridays, called Keeping It Real. They've won statewide and national awards. They're simple observations on the world as it goes on around me, and they're only a few minutes long. They're a passion. You can find them on the same podcast app you're using to listen to this. Finally, if you're interested in advertising on this podcast or the radio show, reach out. I've worked hard to cultivate a specific listener, and I can tell you all about them, and I have many different options for helping you reach them. Thanks again for listening. We'll have another episode available soon.